Welcome to the Authors at Google series. Our guest today is Brooke Gladstone. She is probably best known as the co-host and managing editor of WNYC's On the Media, distributed by NPR. And if I may add, it is available as a downloadable podcast for free, if you can believe it, on onthemedia.org. And Ms. Gladstone has served as NPR's media correspondent, Russia reporter, and senior editor of both Weekend Edition and All Things Considered. She has 2 Peabody Awards, a few Murrow Awards, the National Press Club's Press Criticism Award, and was the recipient of a Knight Fellowship at Stanford University. She is also most recently the author of the edifying and entertaining book, The Influencing Machine, illustrated by Josh Neufeld. Please join me in welcoming Brooke Gladstone.
Thank you.
You're mic'd up.
I am mic'd up. Does this sound okay? I love these. It makes me feel like I have to go out into the audience and, Phil Donahue style, which I don't intend to do. But, I was trying to figure out, I've done a lot of talks on this book, and I was trying to figure out what would make the best sense for people at Google. And it struck me that it made sense to sort of focus on the parts that have to do with the history of communications technology, how we perceive it, and how we've reacted to it through the years, and why the general panic that has ensued in the last decade or so is completely predictable. It's happened many, many times before. I also want to talk about the notion of the quality of information, the fear of echo chambers, the notion of objectivity, these kinds of things. One thing I said at the start of the book was that we all hunger for objectivity, but increasingly we swallow news like Jell-O shots in ad hoc cyber saloons. We love to marinate in the punditry of people with whom we agree, people whose facts we can digest without cognitive distress. And sometimes we feel a little bit queasy about just consuming the media that agrees with us, but we don't blame ourselves for that. We tend to project that nausea back onto the media and blame it or them. We don't really get truly agitated, however, until we uncover the other guy's media. Those guys are consuming lies. Those guys are getting juiced up. Their media diet is making them stupid. So what if our choices are making us stupid? And of course, there was that famous question you may have heard in an Atlantic article a few years back. What if Google is making us stupid? I'm not going to address that too much. I think it's been pretty refuted, but I will get back to it because we need to consider, first of all, our history. And after every new technology, panic has always ensued. Back in when there was the creation of radio, people said it was creating nightmares in kids. Now we think radio is the good technology, the one that forced us to use our imaginations. Of course, there's tremendous panic over what television has done to us, and there's actually a fair amount of decent data to suggest that too much TV watching causes obesity, and that's a serious problem. So I'm not going to dispute that every single technological advance comes with unvarnished wonderfulness attached to it. But the fact is you get something and there's this bug that's really after me. You get something and you lose something at the same time. Socrates disdained writing because he said it hurt the memory. There are lots of people who talked about information overload practically the moment that movable type was invented. There's this guy named Conrad Gessner who tried to put together a list of all published books, and he talked about the harmful and confusing abundance of books. So he decided to leave out anything that wasn't published in Greek, Latin, or Hebrew. So Dante and Chaucer didn't make the cut. This was the only way he could assemble a library of rational proportions. There's, this goes on and on and on all the way through, which then brings me to one of my favorite quotes, which is by Douglas Adams. I'm going to make sure I get it absolutely right. He said, anything in the world that is born when, anything that is in the world when you were born is normal and ordinary and is just a natural part of the way the world works. Anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary. Anything that is invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things. This is what we see over and over again. And to continue with the wisdom of Douglas Adams, of course, he offered the best advice for these terrifying times in 1979 when he described his then imaginary Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He said, it had about 100 tiny flat press buttons and a screen about 4 inches square on which any one of 1,000,000 pages could be summoned at a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated. And this is one of the reasons why it had the words, "Don't panic," written on it in large, friendly letters. And so I think a lot of the thesis of my book involves, we've been here, at least the really bad parts of here, a lot of times before. Don't panic. The difference is the new responsibility that's placed on the news consumer. Up until the mid-20th century, every new development in technology made it cheaper and more democratic, even though it was still insanely expensive and not very democratic. But there was one development that made it enormously expensive and reversed the trend. And so while all of our technology, starting from the penny press and so forth, made it cheaper and really directed itself towards more and more fragmented audiences, by the time we got to mid-20th century America, we had a revolution because there was the invention of television, and never has there been a medium more expensive, more demanding of enormous audiences. And of course, that became the norm. We also had a peculiar period in American politics, which was the Cold War, a time where no fragmentation could be tolerated and where all outliers were marginalized. This is what we have come to call the golden age of objectivity. And I just want to see if I meant to put all of these numbers in the book, and I didn't. So, however, I can probably do it from memory at this point. When we had the telegraph and the steam rotary presses, they were serving an exploding population of immigrants at the very moment a fractured political culture was engaged in a furious argument over what America stood for. When TV came along, the networks had to rely on broadcast licenses and for most of the news. Also, they had to comply with a new regulation that was enacted in 1949 that required them to set aside time to present all sides of the controversial issues they covered. This is called the Fairness Doctrine. A lot of people miss it. But the fact is what that did is cause television not to cover controversial issues. Controversy was bad for the TV biz, and that, of course, was very good for government. The result was symbiosis. To wage the Cold War, the government needed political consensus and ideological conformity. To be profitable, TV needed appeal to the American mainstream. Both thrived by narrowing debate and bottling up cultural and political outliers. So, you have the 1950s. The nation's living rooms had a TV set which served as a kind of national mirror. And what it presented was a populace that was white, Christian, middle class, no accents, no vowels at the end of the name. It defined normal. It defined America. When Walter Cronkite used to end his CBS newscast with the rock-solid assertion that that's the way it is. And that's how he ended for those of you who are too young to remember, that is how Walter Cronkite ended his newscasts. And that's the way it is. It sounds astonishingly arrogant today. Then he was regarded, at least in one poll in the 70s, as the most trusted man in America. His nightly supper-time slice of reality, facts unseasoned and served deadpan, was the standard. Now, a lot of people miss this period of objectivity. They think, you know, all this emotion roiling the media landscape is coarsening the culture, is making us stupid. It's not the emotion that's doing that. It's the lack of respect for facts. And, you know, that's an issue we can get to. But it never seemed to me, looking at the history of American letters and literature, and especially journalism, that you needed to be in an order of passionless priests in order to do good journalism. Some of the nation's best journalism was done by activists in the time, say, of the muckrakers. Some of the best columns, some of the best reporting is done in columns today by people like Nick Kristof, who frequently ends his columns with calls to action. Here's a place where you can support this charity, for instance. That doesn't mean his reporting is bad. It simply means we know who this person is. We know who he cares about. We still trust him to good information. For good information, it doesn't mean because he cares about something that he's going to edit to win the argument and that he's going to ply you with lies. That's not what happens. And another thing is when you say you're objective, how do you know? It doesn't really exist. My favorite discovery, probably in the course of writing this incredibly dense 2 millennia of media history in 160 pages, is when I looked at the famous editorial in 1896 when Adolph Oakes bought the New York Times. He wrote what is regarded as the single best statement of journalism's highest ideals. He wrote, "It will be my earnest aim that the New York Times give the news impartially, without fear or favor, regardless of party, sect, or interests involved, to invite intelligent discussion from all shades of opinion." Well, that "without fear or favor" cut is probably something many of you are familiar with, that you've heard before. And that is where people usually end the quote. But he wrote a whole editorial. And he went on to say, "Nor will there be a departure from the general tone, unless it be to intensify its devotion to the cause of sound money and tariff reform, and advocacy of the lowest tax consistent with good government, and no more government than is necessary to..." In other words, what he regarded as absolute fact after impartially reviewing the evidence was a kind of bedrock belief in a very limited role for government in local affairs. And yet, all around him, there was grinding, dehumanizing poverty at the end of the 19th century. There were, you know, you could see it in the eyes of the people who were selling his paper. Those boys were really miserable. There are pictures and pictures of them I saw online, and it was stunning that he could come to that conclusion, and yet that was his conclusion. His grandson, who in a recent commencement speech bemoaned the fact that that our social safety net is shredding, that we aren't taking care of global warming, that women's right to choose is being threatened. The whole litany of liberal issues was, you know, a sorry state of affairs for this graduating class to be inheriting. I think he would be in profound disagreement over what the true facts are with his own great-grandfather, or maybe grandfather, I guess. So, let us assume then that objectivity is impossible. What are we left with? Well, we're left with fairness. We're left with transparency. We blame the media for hobbling our judgment. We project that out. But is it really purely the problem of media? I mean, media in this country is run by money. I was recently on a panel at the Brooklyn Book Fair, and I found myself in a really weird situation. I was on a panel with people at FAIR and Democracy Now!, among others, and one of the women there had written a book about reality television. And she said that she basically called out corporations for the nefarious agenda of generating and reinforcing negative racial and gender stereotypes through these reality TV shows. And I certainly wouldn't get up there and defend these shows as being paragons of good social, of progressive social ideas. My question was simply about the agenda of the corporations. These corporations have an agenda to make money. If it doesn't pay to make women look like idiots or to keep the black man down, if that's what they're doing, then they wouldn't do it. Another thing is that she had the idea that things were getting worse, and Amos and Andy was raised. Amos and Andy, of course, was at one time the #1 radio show in America. They would stop fights in Madison Square Garden when it was on just to play it or delay the start. There is no single image of anything today that conveys. I mean, we don't have a Cosby show that's overturning a lot of popular notions because we don't have that kind of mainstream media anymore. That mainstream media no longer exists to set the agenda. I think that's where I really ran into problems at the Brooklyn Book Fair. My feeling was that, and is, that increasingly, with every passing day, that agenda is our own as news consumers. And, that is where Google comes in. Because, as Clay Shirky said, in response to all of those people who say we're suffering from information overload, what we really have is filter failure. We all know how to negotiate a bookstore. But if somebody took the contents of a bookstore and dumped it out onto the street, and you went there, you wouldn't be able to find anything. Same thing with a library. If you didn't understand how a library worked, you wouldn't be able to find anything. Well, there is an unbounded universe of information out there online, obviously, and the problem for many of us is we don't know how to find what we want, except through Google, most of the time. Google, always regarded as the demographic way to sort information. You have a question, figure out how to answer it, put it in there, and whatever other people thought was the best answer over time comes to the top. At least that's the simple way of understanding Google. I know you have all dealt with Eli Pariser's concerns that Google may be reinforcing the media echo chamber by using our own behavior to serve us better. That's appalling. How can you do that? Using our own behavior to serve us better eliminates the possibility of serendipity. The more and more we get answers based on our past behavior, the less likely we are to encounter information we otherwise might not encounter. And if people are paying less attention to newspapers, certainly paper newspapers, where you might see an article on Zimbabwe and you thought, well, I never was particularly interested in Zimbabwe, but oh, this looks kind of interesting. And then suddenly you're reading Zimbabwe, accidental encounters with information, serendipity, what happens in a world where you can tailor all your information precisely to where you've been before. This is a problem that concerns me as a news producer, because a lot of times I get asked the question, why don't you just poll people on what they want to know about and then give that to them? And I thought, well, because I thought part of my job was to give people stuff that they didn't know about, that maybe they ought to know about. And so the need to preserve serendipity in, just my production, but also in all news production, is something I'm very concerned about. I do think, however, that people need to be responsible for their own behavior more than they ever have before. This is a caveat emptor world. Our parents didn't have to pick their own health care. They didn't have to pick their own pension plan. They didn't have to pick paper or plastic. And they only had 3 networks. We are used to choosing. And we choose in weird ways because we have to function according to our biases. There's a really fascinating study that was done. There was somebody who had some injury that affected the part of the brain that dealt with emotion. So what you had was a kind of de facto Mr. Spock, you would think. Somebody who could function entirely according to logic. But what happened with that disabled emotional center is that he couldn't function at all. When asked, do you want the black pen or the blue pen? He went down a rabbit hole of, well, the black pen is good for this, the blue pen is good for that, the black pen. When faced with the choice of a mate or even a breakfast cereal, forget it. The person was incapable of making a decision because there was always a countervailing bit of information to take into consideration. And that is why we rely on our emotions, our biases, to help us order the world. We order the world with our emotions and our biases. Otherwise, it's way too complicated. And we use our media consumption to help us solidify some kind of rational notion of how the world works. Back before World War I, and everybody was reading Horatio Alger novels, they really believed that it was a level playing field, and if you worked hard enough, you could pull yourself up by the bootstraps and be a successful American. Later on, that view was mediated by subsequent events. Nevertheless, it was a comforting view. It seemed like a fair view. It was a view that you could certainly anecdotally draw from what you saw around you. Well, now we live in a world of data that is presented visually, data that Google has become better and better at presenting to us. But what is your responsibility, if any, to ensure that people get, since Google is run by an algorithm, you don't have to build our biases into those search results. We may like it, but you don't have to do that. Do you serve us better by, Eli Pariser offered in his book the example of somebody, 2 different people searching BP. And one of them found all sorts of stuff about the environmental damage of the BP oil spill. And another person found its stock ranking, its balance sheet, and this kind of thing. Supposedly, in a purely democratic Google world, they would have gotten the same results based on results that other people found useful. Later on, Jacob Weisberg of Slate tried to reproduce this experiment and found that there weren't differences in the searches. So I don't know what's true and what isn't, and Google doesn't really want to talk about it. I don't know whether it's part of the secret sauce that Google doesn't want anybody to reproduce, but it would be interesting to know how much our behavior is getting built into those searches. We know that it helps us with our spelling. And we also know that Google Translate is able to correct for things. Just the more a language is translated online, the better Google Translate becomes. You know, if you're speaking in a less spoken language, then you're kind of out of luck. And that's a kind of democracy too. Fundamentally, and that was the final analysis of this book, The Influencing Machine. Let me hold it up for all those people on YouTube. The Influencing Machine's final conclusion is that ultimately we get the media that we deserve. I just wonder whether Google, given our built-in biases and our desire to stay in groups with which we agree, what they call homophily, birds of a feather flocking together, whether you can give us better than we deserve. Anyway, I think I'll stop there. Thank you. I have no idea how long I talked. Alex, do you know?
If anybody has questions, you can.
Yes, thank you.
I have a $50,000 question.
Oh, good.
The number 50,000. Okay, the number
yeah.
50,000, which is like a threshold, I guess, in current media. Is that, do you have any evidence that that's scaled over time? Back when you're reaching audiences of hundreds of thousands with, with newspapers, did it take less ridiculous numbers to get people's attention and to make them panic? In the future, is it going to be, 30 billion people, died in a car crash?
Well, you're referring to the chapter in the book where I talk about the odd use of numbers by people in the press and how somebody can come up with a weird number, it's on a TV show, it gets picked up by Congress, then it bounces back. And we found that 50,000 was a number that was particularly durable and used because it was what one FBI agent, former FBI operative, called a Goldilocks number, neither too big nor too small. It was just right. And so at one point, somebody came up with the idea that there were 50,000 predators online, sort of trolling for kids. In the 80s, somebody said, and it got bounced all over the place, that there were 50,000 human sacrifices a year in satanic rites.
So actually, I encountered this number once, which is why it stuck in my head. I had a house fire, and I remember the police telling me there are 50,000 private insurance adjusters just waiting for your business.
Yeah,
Like, wow, really?
wow.
In a city of 1 million? That
Yeah,
seems amazing.
that seems like a fair number. The problem, the only way you can fight these numbers, obviously, is with data. The FBI guy, didn't know about the predators online number because they don't do data for that, but they do for homicides. And in the particular year in which this 50,000 human sacrifice number was cited, the FBI had only counted up 25,000 homicides, which meant that there were more than twice as many counted homicides of any kind just in the human sacrifice vein. So clearly it was bullshit. But in terms of your number, are there other hot numbers out there, or has the number grown?
Float? Yeah.
Well, media itself electronic media itself in the history of humankind is not very old. And I do think that our hunger for focus on love of the illusory certainty of numbers is not something that necessarily dates back to the beginning of electronic media. I'm guessing that because there were fewer numbers then, there were probably fewer opportunities to elect a number most popular, the way that 50,000 in recent years has been elected.
Thanks.
Anything else? Yeah.
Do you want to use the microphone?
Yeah, use the microphone.
So when you talk about the influencing machine, I start thinking about media that has, so we have more people making media, if I can put that in quotes now. And that can be interpreted in a lot of ways. One section that's really intriguing to me is the creation of silly little internet memes. So I'm sure you've come across I Can Has Cheeseburger. And to me, that is an interesting thing because in and itself, it's not a joke. It's not, as an image, as an objective view of the image, I Can Has Cheeseburger with a cat's face on it isn't funny. But 10 people in the world decided that this is funny, and then it snowballed from there. And then in the creation of this whole new language, which all these people came together and decided this is funny. And then it kept snowballing, and that's something that goes on in a lot of memes online. Do you have sort of a point of view on where that fits in the whole objective-subjective paradigm and how that fits into the influencing machine, if I may put it that way?
It's, I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but if you're saying that, where does this election of certain memes as being particularly popular or as a place to land briefly as you go on, these are, there was a time when people would stand around the water cooler and talk about the Mary Tyler Moore Show. This is an environment in which those moments become briefer and briefer and briefer, and maybe they're only as big as a single still photo. But there is a world of absurdity or ironic detachment that can be conveyed in even a single still message, or just a kind of mysterious resonation that just sort of appeals. I mean, I don't get them all. I do get some of them, and I think they're hilarious, and some of them pass me right by. You know, I've certainly been guilty of sending a lot of these things around as well. And I was an early sender of of Pearl on the Funny or Die, the drunken 2-year-old yelling at Will Ferrell. I mean, I just couldn't get enough of it. But that was lengthy. And there are plenty of others that I've sent around over the years. I think that they're a way to hook up. It's part of this global sense of humor that emerges not to unite people, but to create different communities around the world. Just as they're created around issues, they could be created around these cultural moments and these cultural memes. This is another way in which a new kind of cultural arrangement, I don't want to say order because it isn't hierarchical, but it's a new way that we connect, which is unfamiliar. It's new. It's not how we ever connected before, and it has no reference to time or space. It's part of that kind of community that could only exist in a world without time and space.
Thank you.
I hope that sort of got there.
It did.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Trey Harris. I'm an engineer here at Google New York. I loved your book, and in July I was posting on Twitter and Google Plus about the book as I was reading it, and this was kind of in the middle of the whole Vivian Schiller mess and NPR. I think a lot of people were kind of just searching the web for NPR and waiting to jump into things to argue about, but.
Well, thank you for posting it then.
But one interesting, I got like 50 responses to this one post that I made that about the book, and the argument that people got into was, and I think some of the kind of right-wing anti-NPR types kind of egged them on, but it's some of the people who say that they always give to their NPR stations. Got into it. They said that they thought that it was unfair what you were doing with the book. That, for instance, the YouTube promo where it had the on the media music and the fact that the book subtitle had on the media in it, that you were like springboarding off of what were partially public dollars and partially pledged dollars, to do some sort of self-aggrandizement, between you and Neufeld. And I just wondered if you would just respond, because I think that it's perfectly reasonable for somebody to have a career and try to move forward with their career, especially in ideas as important as the ones you bring up. But
I think it's a fair criticism, and I thought about it. I know that Bob wanted to interview me on the book, and I said absolutely not. It was Norton that obviously wanted to. I am who I am. It wasn't it wasn't NPR that was promoting the book. It was Norton, probably Norton and other people who had approached me over the years to write a book did it because I had a selling platform. So it's true, I let them use the music. We didn't stop them from using the music. On the other hand, Ben Allison just has it on a record, so anybody can use the music. I could see why people might think that because there's public money involved, I don't know. How does any author sell a book while boxing off what made them competent, if they were competent, to write the book? It's my expertise developed over years on the program that, otherwise why not just say The Influencing Machine by Anonymous? It doesn't really make sense. I sympathize with the queasiness. I had some. I did not want this subtitle, Brooke Gladstone on the Media. That was definitely Norton. I had like 20 billion other subtitles. And they went, nah, let's go with this. And I was like, oh, gee, that's a surprise. But it's, so I can identify with the queasiness, but I honestly feel that this is, it's my own project and Josh's, and it is a product of mine and Josh's past. That's what we have to recommend us. Josh wrote a brilliant book on Katrina called AD After the Deluge. Should he not put that in anything? I understand that I work for a nonprofit, but I don't think that means I have to put a gag order on any reference to what I've done in my history with nonprofits. I've been with NPR since 1987. That's a long time to black out. So I sympathize, but not enough to not use it. It's a fair question.
If I could follow up on the question of it being a project between you and Josh, how did that work? I mean, it's a graphic novel nonfiction book. I mean, did you write the text and he illustrated it? Did you have meetings and?
It was quite interesting. I decided to do it this way. I decided it was possible to do this way after I read two books. One was Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, which is a magisterial work of sheer genius that I kept by my bed the whole time. And the other was the comic book, the graphic novelization of Paul Auster's City of Glass, which is a gorgeous book in which there's much abstract, non-linear thinking going on, which is conveyed so brilliantly by Dave Mazzucchelli and the other people who worked on that book. Now, I saw what was possible, and I saw kind of what you had to do it. I have gotten media books in my office once a week for the last decade, and it's very frustrating because they can be very hard to get through. They tend to fall in one or two camps. It's either a right-wing book that's masquerading as media criticism, or a left-wing book masquerading as media criticism. In other words, they're political proxy books. Or else it's the collapse of civilization, doom is nigh, or else we are teetering on the brink of an absolute gorgeous cyber utopia, so don't worry about a thing. And I felt like I was steering a middle course. And that seems like, well, that's okay, what's the big deal with that? But that means that a lot of people got mad at me on both sides of that line. But I wanted to do it in a way, I wanted to build my argument on a series of historical anecdotes that I thought were terrifically significant, and I wanted those ideas to be sticky. And I understand about visual images being sticky. I mean, somebody talks to me about this book, and they ask me a question, I'll say, well, remember that picture where blah, blah, blah? And they'll remember it a lot faster than they will the argument. I also wanted to try something new. And I felt that this would be much more like radio, which I know is a little weirdly counterintuitive. Radio is the medium without pictures, but radio is incredibly intimate. Anybody who listens to it on a regular basis knows that you have a relationship with that voice, which is not the same as with newspaper reporting or television. There's a person there. There has to be a person there. And I'm used to writing for radio, done it almost all of my professional life, and I wanted to speak in bubbles and look the reader in the eye. So I was able to do that. Also, this book, unlike almost every other bit of graphic nonfiction, with the exception of Scott McCloud, is non-linear. It's non-chronological. You're jumping back and forth. You need a guide. You need a Virgil to take you through this very complicated territory, especially since we're hopping back and forth through a couple of millennium with a little side trip to the Stone Age and to the year 2045. And so you really need somebody to sort of hold your hand through that thing, and I wanted to be that person. In terms of the process, I know this is a long answer, but that was really interesting because the difference between a graphic book like this one and an illustrated book is that an illustrated book supports the text, but a graphic book in panels replaces the text. Now, when I first wrote my first few pages for Josh, he said, what is this? And I said, well, I hope I didn't give you too much. Here's my suggestion for what I think could be in the page, but I don't want to cramp your artistic freedom. And he went, oh, no, you totally don't get it. He said that you have to tell me exactly what you want me to draw. I can't read your mind. So for 1,000 panels, essentially what I did was write, say there were 20 words of text in the panel, a detailed description of 200 words of, how to arrange the whole thing, and then maybe a half a dozen links to visual reference points for Josh. Josh was brilliant. He did an astonishing job of writing funny columns and comics that are absolutely tragic, based on a lot of photographic material and a lot of fancy. There were a lot of times when I sent him something and he would say, no, Brooke, you cannot fit the entire Crimean War in a single panel. You can do one horseman, or you can do a 2-page splash, but what you're asking for, an army of 1 trillion extras, is not going to happen in 1/6 of a comic page, So he was kind of like the experienced director of photography. Brilliantly skilled, experienced director of photography. And I was like the newbie director. I storyboarded every single panel, and when it worked, he did it as I asked, and when it didn't, he would suggest other angles, and we both worked towards the production of this book. But the astonishing thing for me, was how much fun and how illuminating, how much I learned looking for reference points. So much information in this book I happened upon serendipitously when looking for visual reference points for Josh.
But so the many visual callouts, like the Gin Lane and Beer Street one, for instance, that
I
came from
sent
you,
him the
not
Hogarth, and I said, do this Hogarth, but I want you to have them reading these newspapers, and I sent him a list of the names of newspapers that were being read in the time that I'm talking about. But yes, I sent him the Hogarth, I sent him the Vitruvian Man, I sent him all this stuff, and then he had to make sense of it. And he was drafting these frames even after my descriptions, some of which were not possible to follow. I mean, he had to teach me all the time the art of the possible. By the end, I sort of got it. But I had to completely redo the war section, which is kind of a book within a book, because what I had asked him to do was quite literally impossible. Had to completely send revisions on every single one of those panels. I thought he was going to, it was just surprising he was able to keep his equanimity.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned someone else mentioning that Google is perhaps part of the problem here.
That what is?
That Google is perhaps part of the problem here in terms of focusing the results on what the person is expecting or what we know about that person's expectations. And I think most people that work at Google have actually thought this themselves at one point along the line. Are we contributing to narrowing everybody's worldview? But the flip side of that, isn't it, is what you mentioned in terms of a corporation. Google's job is not to educate and uplift the intelligence of the population, right? Our job is to make money. And if we don't deliver the results that people want, even if that is very much narrowcasting, people are going to go to Yahoo or Bing or something, and Google will, fall by the wayside. So I'm not really sure how to do that. I have sympathy for that.
And how does that conflict with the don't be evil mandate?
Well, yeah, don't be evil, but don't. I'm not sure. Yeah, is it really evil though to deliver the results that people expect?
This is a really, it is a fine irony. When Eli Pariser was complaining about Google, he was also complaining about Facebook dropping people off of his newsfeed these conservatives, he's very liberal, he's the founder of Move On, these conservatives that he had friended so he could sort of see what was going on there. And Facebook eventually dropped their things from his newsfeed. I'm sure he has many hundreds or thousands of friends, so because he wasn't going to them. And he was like, how could they do that? They've just edited my stuff for me. But you weren't going to them. So the question is you know, you want to create a situation where, like for instance, if I created an RSS feed that had tons of stuff in it that I wasn't interested in it, and I didn't go to them, what good is the RSS feed? Ultimately, we have to be responsible for going outside our comfort zones. The only trouble is Google is a way to get outside your comfort zone painlessly in the process of doing a basic search. So it would be a shame if Google served us so well that an area of serendipity disappeared. I understand that there is a conflict. At this point, I don't see any real competition on the horizon. And maybe the narrowing of the focus isn't, have they done lots of studies to determine whether or not you're way more successful and you make a lot more money and people click to more things when you do searches based on their past behavior? Do we know? Is it good business, or do we just think it's good business? I guess is the question. I'm sure there's an answer out there. I just don't know what it is.
In the print media, the example that I think of like major newspapers, of the major newspaper that tried to do this, tried to be erudite and educate people in terms of stuff they should know, would be the Christian Science Monitor, right? And they didn't survive, right? People go for New York Times with its supposed liberal bias, or the Wall Street Journal and Fox News for the other side of it. And
I don't know that I would distinguish a whole lot between the Christian Science Monitor and the New York. Some of these, I think the Christian Science Monitor went through so many cuts, they started doing less and less reporting. It was the vicious circle that's happened with a lot of newspapers, where they just, they keep cutting back their service, so then fewer people come, and then they have to cut back their service anymore, and eventually they disappear. I think that, I wouldn't say that the mission of the Christian Science Monitor was radically different from that of the New York Times. I just think that the Christian Science Monitor didn't have enough reserves, wasn't big enough to survive the darkest times and to adapt appropriately. I wouldn't say, well, there's an example of a pure newspaper that didn't survive because it tried to be really good. I can't really believe that.
So I think this will be the last question. Go ahead.
So you mentioned earlier the effect of the fact that media organizations are businesses on how they, basically on everything that they do. And I was wondering what your perspective was on how that means that wealthy individuals and wealthy corporations can use that wealth to direct the media discussion.
Well, certainly the patronage model seems to be making a comeback. If you look at ProPublica, which does amazing work in partnership with lots of other mainstream media outlets, they essentially function because they get lots of grants and stuff, but basically it's one family that supports this organization and enables it to function. It does it according to very high ideals of journalism. Every news outlet has to decide what it is worth covering and what isn't, and they'll make those decisions maybe along liberal lines, but it's good work, it's solid work, it's prize-winning work in the case of the amazing piece that was done about the hospital during Katrina, where they just let some patients die. That, I don't know if you saw it in the New York Times. It was a really stunning piece that won a Pulitzer. It's rich people will come back into this in a big way, I think, if they're willing to lose money, because they will. I mean, but rich people have always been, and I mean, it's always been rich families that's owned a lot of America's great and worst newspapers and magazines. I think that rich people will direct the discussion with news outlets more. The most noticeable way I think that rich people direct coverage is by being desirable audience members. And the fact of the matter is, I've been upbraided, and I think correctly, because I say that the media reflects all of America, and I think it pretty much does in a funhouse mirror. It's a little distorted, it's a little cracked, it's not well calibrated, but essentially we're all out there, and so is everybody else that we can't stand. But one thing that is hugely unrepresented is poor people. And I really do think that's because of the fact that for most media, this is an advertising-run business. I think you'll see maybe a little bit more of that on public media, but not a whole lot more. I think there should be more. I mean, there's been over the last 50 years, there's been an explosion of business reporting and a complete shriveling of labor reporting. There are things out there that relate to coverage that have everything to do with wealth. I think mostly it's a great thing if we can get rich people to part with their money. I work for National Public Radio, so I could use it. Actually, I work for WNYC, but same thing. Well, thank you guys very much. It was a pleasure.